Project Glasswing is Anthropic's latest announcement around using AI to find and, in some cases, exploit software vulnerabilities. I'm Sean McMillan, community manager here at Bishop Fox, and to discuss this, I'm joined today by Matt Welling, partner with Holland and Knight, Yuri Goryunov, CIO with Xcelligence, and Zach Marino, AVP of Consulting here at Bishop Fox. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Happy to be here.
Yeah, just to kind of level set, Anthropic is saying this model can find vulnerabilities across major systems and chain them into exploits with limited human input. Zach, I wonder if you could give us a quick breakdown of what was announced and kind of how you're thinking about it at this time.
Yeah, so essentially, it's a new model. It's still in limited preview right now, but it's finding vulnerabilities that have kind of been there in code for a long time. In some cases, 20 plus years. It's finding these unique attack chains that, let's be honest, if we had a whole bunch of security researchers looking through the code and trying to put it together, you know, they might not still even find it. I mean, OpenBSD, one of the areas where this vulnerability was identified, is built around being secure. And it found this long-standing vulnerability that's been there for how long, after how many eyes have poured over this. And I think if you really kind of boil it down to what this is, what this particular model does really well at is, and AI in general, it's taking all this context, all this code, and kind of putting it together in a way that humans just, at least for me, when I look at source code for too long, I kind of lose context of where I'm at. I may not remember, oh, there was that little function earlier where I could probably pull in some input, or I could throw this into there and it's going to happen later down in the code. Versus the AI model, it has much more memory than I do. And it can remember all these little things, and it can go through and actually find these unique attack chains. And I think that's kind of like the core of what this is, right? This is a really cool way to go through and find these 0 days and exploit them, actively exploit them. That's one of the key things that kind of stood out to me in Anthropic's release about this, was that it could actually build the exploits, which is fantastic and really cool, because with it's the same thing we talk about often with humans, where I can be really good in one domain, but if I don't have experience, say, writing Python exploits, right, I'm going to have to kind of work my way up and try to level up my skill set, or hopefully I have somebody on my team who's there. But with these models, those are my Python exploit experts, right? Or we can suddenly pivot to Ruby, and I don't have to spend this time to kind of gear up. And I think that's just so cool, right? So that's the core of it, is that this is enabling security researchers, companies, to just kind of really dive into the code and really find these exploits that have been there under the covers.
I think the announcement is incredibly interesting, but it's moving in the direction that I think there was a lot of prediction that these AI tools would move in terms of shortening the speed at which vulnerabilities are identified, finding a broader range of them, and doing that in a way that not only is doing that in isolation, but finding them in combinations, which creates a lot of legal and compliance risk for companies, both those who are publishing tools as well as their customers that are using them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk about this that you obviously have a more nuanced understanding, but you see this headline everywhere, and it feels like there's so much weight behind it, and this is like a world-changing event. I'm curious how you kind of see this as the hype versus what's actually going on, and what people need to worry about.
I think I think for me, and I can't speak for Yuri, but I actually got a few text messages that were like almost to the extent of saying, "I'm so sorry. Sorry Anthropic released this. Like,
Yeah,
are you going to be okay?" And I'm like,
yeah,
I'm going to be perfectly fine. I think that there's a core misunderstanding of what this actually is, right? I think there's some people who see this and there are some people who see this headline and think, oh, Anthropic completely changed the game here. There's no more need for pen testing. There's no more need for all these things. It's going to handle everything for you. It's going to, slice your bread and toast it for you as well. And I think there's a lot more nuance to that. I think there's a lot more to this than like I think this is a fantastic, fantastic move forward in the industry. I don't think this is just pure hype. I think this is going to be something that is going to be game changing because again, it's going to allow security researchers, even people without security experience, to start finding these vulnerabilities within their code base. And it's just going to continue to move the needle to a more secure coding world. And I think that's fantastic.
It does
Yeah.
open up a set of real questions on who and how do you engage to participate in this. It's like citizen coders and citizen security analysts now are able to test anything they'd like. Um, I think one of the biggest issues and interesting points that I think about is, Anthropic is a known entity with a known release of a model. Are there some other entities that are working on models right now that will be just as powerful that are flying under the radar? And then as security professionals and information professionals, how do we make sure that, we keep tabs on them, and then we're able to bring in the best of those tools into our environments to continue with this program of ensuring safety, recognizing that the price of doing nothing just becomes unsustainable.
Yeah, I think it is definitely an announcement that those in the industry and really just sort of broadly should pay attention to. I think you're exactly right that as we learn more, companies and other organizations should be paying attention to what this really means and um, what the operational impacts are for them. And from that, then they'll be able to assess their areas of risk. And that's not just on the operational side. That's kind of where my focus is as a lawyer is understanding what does this mean for you, and that is going to be on the adoption side, so proactively looking for risk and all that. So what does it mean if vulnerabilities in your products, either those you're selling or those you're using, come up more quickly, but then also reactively having this information at that speed and the possible downstream effects of that. What's that going to mean for your organization as you're in litigation, in regulatory or other investigations, when you're dealing with contractual counterparties, when you're signing new contracts, as well as developing your own internal policies and procedures. I think one of the big themes that we're hearing that I agree with is this probably isn't sort of a categorical shift. Instead, it should really encourage organizations to be refocusing and really doubling down on their hygiene, because again, from kind of the legal risk standpoint, this is a new tool to potentially find those areas of risk, but they're not new risks necessarily. You're just finding them quicker, which may also trigger patching to occur more quickly, and some of those timelines and some of those cycles as you're thinking about your policies, your internal operations, your contracting practices, your assurance practices are going to have to keep up with that speed or adjust to that speed. And I think at the lane I'm in, that's probably the biggest area of focus, right? The operational pieces have certainly gotten the most attention, but I think the theme I would be looking at is hygiene and making sure you're really kind of staying focused and clean there.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're running a security program, what steps should you be taking? What should you be thinking about kind of down the road in planning for this new kind of environment?
Well, at a minimum, getting a good sense of what is your environment like. Do you have a full control of what your environment looks like? We've seen with Claude and others an emergence of not just department developed applications, but individual developed applications. Anybody can code, a fit for purpose portal for their needs. How do we make sure that the data that's stored in there is protected? How do we even know that they exist? I think that that's honestly one of the biggest challenges right now is understanding all the entry points.
Yeah.
Well, and I think as well, one of the things that's kind of changing with this release is it changes the landscape. It changes, I like to think of this from an enterprise perspective, right? As somebody who's spent quite a bit of time in enterprise application security, um, how does this change my approach, right? It used to be that I could get away with, one big pen test for my crown jewels, maybe do it twice a year if I really want to kind of go at it. And then my other applications that may be externally facing, but I'm not as worried about them, I might do those every year or every other year. If my code is changing frequently, if I'm still doing quarterly releases, if I'm still doing even shorter releases, well, now that sort of changes, right? I think as these models continue to get better at, even more just so than source code, as these get better at doing dynamic type testing, right? This
Yeah.
changes the frequency at which I probably should be looking at my environment, looking at my applications, and making sure that those get tested. Um, so it's really like I think the days of annual and quarterly penetration tests and overall assessments, right? And to Yuri's point, understanding what my overall environment looks like, I need to be more on top of that. I can't be as lax as I may have been in like 2016.
Yeah. But this also enables that more, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. This makes it easier if you're doing this correctly and you're augmenting your security staff correctly. This allows you to do those, right? So maybe, you know, just kind of thinking out loud here with your developers, maybe your security team is able to put in a logic gate in there that's like, hey, before this code releases, we run it through and we do these security checks just as a kind of just a
Preemptive.
quick
Yeah.
check to make sure that everything's okay, right? Because it's going to do it, where we might need 120 hours to really dive into the code manually just with my eyes and some source code analysis. This can do it much quicker. Or even better, a human with this model can do this much quicker and really provide yeah, this is important. Or, because some of these vulnerabilities may be one where it's like not really practical to exploit. We often see that where we have vulnerabilities, we see things where it's like, yeah, technically you're vulnerable. Technically, this could, allow an attacker to hijack a session. But to do that, they would need to be on the wire. They would need to be blah, blah, blah. They would need to be like all these things would have to go there. And I think that's where the humans kind of come into play here is that they can provide that extra logic where it's like, is this practical? Do we need to rip this out? Or is this a level of risk that we can accept?
Yeah.
Well,
And that,
I think it's actually opens up the possibility to remediate a lot of the problems that were previously infeasible, non-feasible to remediate because you have you can unleash the agent on deploying the fixes.
Well, yeah, it's like what we were talking about earlier, where I might not be the best exploit developer in Ruby, and I might not know how to fix that vulnerability, right? I might be like, oh, I'm gonna have to throw this into the next sprint. But to your point, unleash the model on it, and boom, I'm ready this go around.
I think one of the things that actually is really interesting to me is that how do we, ensure fairness in access to these models? And I'm thinking about, specifically in the current announcement. Yes, great. They were opening up and bringing the biggest companies. Okay, well, what about mid-sized companies? What about small companies
yeah.
that, who's at what point, where are they in the pecking order? And how do we set up a system that allows for fair access to these capabilities?
So you kind of mentioned the capabilities of this and for the organizations that are allowed to use it and then touched on even better if a human is involved and validating and kind of guiding. I'm curious how you kind of see that relationship, how the human and AI coexistence makes this system really fire.
Yeah, I think you know, to simplify it, I think about it a lot as judgment, right? The human in the middle is really exercising judgment at the end of the day. And that may be through a combination of actions using the AI, using sort of human activity. It could be interpreting the results, prioritizing the results. But where the AI ultimately isn't replacing the human, works, very well in concert with the human, is around areas of judgment. And those two are going to vary for different organizations, right? With the same results, um, that may present very different risk from company A versus company B, just like other areas of cyber risk, and other areas of corporate risk and enterprise risk. That it's important to understand what do those results mean for your organization, and what does that mean for your priorities. Um, every organization ultimately has scarce resources in terms of people, funds, time. So how are you interpreting those results, and how are you prioritizing them? The one thing I think that's really interesting, that as we up the speed of discovery, um, that may reduce some of the resource strains in other areas to allow more time for consideration, judgment, other activities. And I think as there are more risks that come up with this, because we're going to presumably continue finding vulnerabilities and downstream effects of that more quickly, it may also open up considerable new opportunities to be able to address those risks, individually or in combination.
Yeah, I think part of it, I think what's really going to be important is the human needs to stay in the loop. I think the human needs to be there because they can provide that additional context, that additional insight into what actually matters. Um, and then they can also make it actionable, right? The volume, the speed at which AI can identify these vulnerabilities is insane, right? We all know it's way faster than any human could.
Yeah.
Um, and I think if you have all these findings, but you don't have the context, it can almost cause an analysis paralysis, so to speak, right? Where
Right.
I have all these vulnerabilities, and yeah, I could tell it to fix it, but like, is the fix going to actually break some other functionality, right? And that's where I think the context is important, right? I think the context is important in this regard because it'll allow you to take action on the things that actually matter and make sure that's not going to impact some downstream functionality that may be important to the overall user experience. So I think it's less of like how many vulnerabilities did we find, but it's more like what actually represents real tangible risk. What could impact my user data? What could break my authenticate, like what could break my flow for the specific environment? What could give somebody the keys to the kingdom? And I think that's where it's important that humans again remain in the loop. I think they are going to be able to provide that context specific to the business, specific to the enterprise, specific to the small company, that no matter how much we give AI, it may not be able to fully comprehend it because it just looks at it in terms of the scope of what it has of the code base.
I think that the urgency is actually a bit higher here because, once you identify something, um, you probably should have an assumption that somebody else can identify it as well. And then if you choose not to act on some things, some exploits or vulnerabilities, then somebody else might.
I guess one last thought here is, as you read this, Zach, you mentioned that you got some text messages, almost, doomsaying text messages. But as you read through this, what were your thoughts for your role, your plans? How does this affect how you're thinking about this moving forward in your organization?
Yeah, I think for us, it's, ensuring that, first of all, our clients are in the list of the companies that have access to this, and if not, then they have access to those capabilities as well. I would have loved to see more of critical infrastructure companies and their healthcare companies. Right now, it's yes, I understand the financial services and hyperscalers, but what about folks that really are exposed? So I just think it's it's a call to action and an exciting time to get organized and get moving on these.
I think for me, what this really just highlighted is kind of the area of focus that we as Bishop Fox have been focusing on, which is the external attack surface, because I think this highlights just even more that that's where a lot of the risk lies. A lot of these vulnerabilities, um, you identify them in the code base, and they're definitely extremely important. Um, And I think it's going to be a critical piece. And one of the cool things I like about this too is that if you have a lot of dependencies in your code, this now allows you to actually identify any vulnerabilities in there quicker, right? I've
Yeah.
had people ask me like, "Hey, how do I identify and get rid of any potential backdoors in this?" And I'm like, "How much time do you have? And how many people do you have that can look into this, right?" And maybe this can identify all the back doors, maybe it can't, but I think it's gonna get you much closer. I think it's gonna get you much closer to doing that, which then leaves your biggest vulnerability is your external attack surfaces, which is where we kind of focus in on. And I think
Yeah.
this is just gonna further strengthen um, the overall security posture, which is great, right? I think I've talked about this years ago, where really I think the next generation of warfare is going to continue to be in the cyber landscape. I think this is where um, people are going to start going. I mean, we've already seen it where nation states are attacking other nation states. They're
Yeah.
starting to attack corporations. And I think your external attack surface is going to be a critical piece of that. Yeah, they may throw a backdoor into this one dependency that, they know you use, but if the front door is wide open, I'd rather go through the front door as opposed to trying to
Easier.
get something into a package that you may not even pick up that package, right? You may have a rule where I need to be N-3 versions that I know are stable. So great,
Yeah.
I introduced that, but now I can't guarantee I'm going to get in. But if you've got a really cool iDoor, or if you've got some other way for me to get into your app or pivot into your AWS environment, that's much easier for me as an attacker, as a nation state, right? So I think I'm excited for this. This is not a scary thing for me. I'm really excited to see where this kind of goes and where overall cybersecurity continues to trend.
All right. Well, I think that's a good point to end on. I think it's an exciting new era for cybersecurity in general and offensive security in particular. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Sean.
And if you found this useful, share it around your organization. But until next time, stay safe.